it's Rosemary. Today is going to be a little different. I've thrown on a blazer instead of my pole gear, and I want to talk about the history of pole dancing. So this is going to be a comprehensive look into how pole dancing started, as well as the influences for it and misconceptions and other things that I wanted to get into related to the history. What we know about pole dancing, it didn't start that long ago as a fitness trend. It started in the 90s and studios started popping up early 2000s. So we've been able to credit two women with the introduction of pole dancing into the mainstream as a fitness regimen. So I want to start with Fanny Amande, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly because I've only seen it written, but if I'm not pronouncing it correctly, please feel free to correct me in the comments. So I want to talk about her. She was born in Kelowna, BC. She moved to Vegas and became a stripper. She noticed she had lost 30 pounds since she started and decided to take pole dancing, which is what the majority of her job was in Vegas, started taking it mainstream. She started making videos to help people learn on Instagram. Her studio is called Pole Fitness Studio. She got the most basic pole fitness studio name. All other studios have different names. She got Pole Fitness Studio. She started in '94, and since then, pole dancing has only gotten bigger and bigger. Since pole dancing's conception in the 90s, pole dancing has had a wonderful evolution. Pole dancing has spread all over the world. There are hundreds of studios across the world. And in 2017, pole dancing got registered as a sport. And as of 2020, when I am recording this, pole dancing is extremely close to becoming a part of the Olympics. Pole dancing lends itself to so many different styles. You can look into exotic, contemporary. I've seen the Singing in the Rain number with tap shoes. So in the early 2000s, there was another woman named Sheila Kelly, was an actress, and for a role in which she played an exotic dancer, she began pole dancing with strippers and realized what a good workout routine it was, and she created a fitness studio called S Studio, in which pole dancing was a big component. And these were originating people who did something revolutionary for that time, right? Is it dramatic to call pole dancing revolutionary? That's up to you. The common denominator from these two women, who are both credited with starting pole dancing in the mainstream, is stripping. So I want to talk about the influences of stripping, how long it's been around, and really get into that. So a lot of people don't necessarily like talking about it. Even pole dancers are kind of hesitant to talk about stripping. I personally don't think it should be, so let's talk about it and normalize some things. So a lot of people, when they hear the word stripping, they think of businessmen, cocaine, and the 80s. But stripping has a way more extensive history than just that, so I wanted to get into the history of stripping. Because stripping and pole dancing are so entangled, the history of stripping will feed into the history of pole dancing as well. Taking it all the way back, there are references to women dancing or entertaining for money in the Bible. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of historical precursors to what we consider stripping today. The main thing when I'm talking about historical influences is the ability to draw a line between them. Because Fanny Amande and Sheila Kelly mentioned their experience with stripping, that's a direct line. And there's a direct line from stripping to its precursors in history. I'm primarily going to focus on the start of stripping in the 19th century, even though there are references to women dancing for men throughout history. The connections become looser. So we're going to take it back to the late 19th century. There are generally three different schools of thoughts on exotic dancing: European, Asian, and American. And because of the geographical distribution of strip clubs, we're generally going to be sticking to American and a little bit of European, because the Asian evolution is different than the American evolution, and European is similar to American. So in the late 19th century, we are going to talk about the first direct influence of modern stripping is the Moulin Rouge and the Follies. Brigade pronunciation isn't going to be great here. So they were both in France, and these are the can-can style of dancers, the big dresses and the big entertaining. So if you don't know what that is, they were big stages and they were much more produced. If you go to a strip club now, you will see a girl on stage and she's basically improvising. The Follies and Moulin Rouge were very structured. The earlier on you go, the more structured you get in I would say, the pageantry of the dance numbers that you'd see. And from that birthed burlesque. Burlesque in America was also classified as cooch dancing or hoochie coochie dancers, and there's a bunch of different names that you can find for like similar era style dancing. So cooch dancing, eroticized dancing, and had the similar pageantry and the focus on femininity as you would see in the Moulin Rouge, but it was far more eroticized. And the main thing about this style is that there was starting to be a racial component. Most people don't necessarily think of a racial component when it comes to stripping, but for girls who strip, even in places like Canada, where I'm from, girls who call clubs and ask to dance will get asked first what their race is before other questions. So a lot of historical racial things were coming into play here. So the coochie dancers had highly eroticized movements, and there's a divide between the white dancers and the exotic dancers. So a direct influence for that would be the case of Sarah Baartman, or the Hottentot woman, and I'm not going to try to pronounce her technical name. I will butcher it and I'm very sorry. But I will post a link below to some base information about her. Her case is super interesting. Basically what it was, she was a slave woman who was paraded around Europe because of her traditional African proportions, so a larger butt, different shapes that white women didn't have. And she was paraded around as being this hypersexual being because she had different proportions than white women. So along a similar line to her eroticization, what these burlesque clubs were seeing as well. So opening the show, there would be white women, and then closing the show, there would be exotic women. So what that meant in practice was Middle Eastern and African women, aka darker skinned bodies. And because of these heavy racial overtones and the exotic girls who were performing, that birthed the term exotic dancing. So these cooch dancing shows were either in burlesque style clubs or they would be traveling around with the circus. So similar names, hoochie coochie dancers. There's also the phrase Kahawanazi. I'm not sure how to pronounce that one either, but that's another word thrown around when talking about this style in this era. So moving on from that era, we move into the upscale Broadway cabaret, primarily because of industrial capitalism. Going to these upscale cabarets were a sign of social standing. So if you could afford to go to these places, you were seen as a high-class gentleman. If you've been paying attention to the racial overtones in this video, you'll know that the upscale Broadway cabaret dancers were typically white and lighter skinned. The continuation of coochie and chorus dancers, is how they're referred to, were darker skinned. And those clubs that featured those dancers were heavily associated with moral depravity and prostitution. However, the Venn diagram of men who went to the upscale clubs and men who went to the lower class clubs was almost a circle. The main difference was how they viewed the dancers, so how they viewed the race of the dancers. Obviously, there was a lot of drinking, there was naked women, and especially in the time of Prohibition, they wanted to cut down on depravity in total, so they closed what they called grindhouses down. So then in 1964, Carol Doda danced topless in a club in San Francisco. The dates I managed to find when talking about when stripping kind of picked up again was the early 70s in the USA and the later 70s in Canada. And from the 70s to now, which is in 2020, the peak era for strip clubs was the 90s and early 2000s. And then once the recession hit in 2008, strip clubs took a major dive. The movie Hustlers explains the impact on the industry during that time rather well. If you haven't seen that movie, if you have, then you know what I'm talking about. So to recap, the influences on stripping were clubs like the Moulin Rouge, burlesque, cabaret, coochie dancers, traveling circuses, and grindhouses. So in reality, because the two women who are generally credited with the beginning of the pole fitness trend have specifically mentioned that stripping, losing weight due to stripping, or stripping to prepare for a role was the reason they started. Those are the influences of pole dancing. And now I know what you're gonna say. What about the ancient Indian style? Which brings me to my next point, which is the popular misconceptions about pole dancing. And there's a bunch of misconceptions, even though the two women who are credited with pole dancing are alive. And they said they got really fit due to stripping. That's basically it. But because stripping is such a sensitive topic, there are misconceptions where people have tried to make history fit into pole dancing to sanitize it for people who don't support sex workers or strippers, that think sex workers, for lack of a better word, are dirty. I personally don't understand how you could say that. Maya Angelou is a sex worker, and nobody would dare to say that she's lowbrow, you know? So unfortunately, the history is stripping, and if that's something that you have a problem with, please find a different sport. There are many sports out there, you will find one. I'm not saying you have to master exotic or wear heels in every number that you're gonna do, but if you're gonna pursue pole dancing, you have to at least have some amount of respect for the women and people who created this sport. They created the sport that you love, and if you can't respect them, you don't respect the sport. So moving on to the popular misconceptions. If you're a pole dancer, you've probably gone to a pole dancing studio, and they probably have a sign that says, pole dancing started 1200 years ago. Popular misconception. Ancient Indian style of Malakam. Again, pronunciation's gonna be terrible. Basically, an overview of this is a really thick wooden pole, potentially two, that men would jump between and climb. It was a pure strength thing, and women were not allowed to participate. Thinking about the moves that pole dancing does and why we use heels in general, especially the types of moves that strippers created and not modern pole dancers, there's almost no connection to a thick wooden pole just for climbing. Pole dancing is pole dancing because of the pageantry and the dance, and it was definitely not created with a thick wooden pole in mind, or else the material would be wood. Metal poles were in strip clubs in the 80s, and that's what we use. Poles are thin in comparison to the wooden poles that they were using. There's almost no connection other than the fact that poles were involved, especially because pole dancing is a female-centered sport, and we weren't even allowed to participate in this style. So calling a thick wooden pole where women weren't allowed to participate an influence of pole dancing is almost insulting, because if it was, there'd be a lot more men in the sport. 2 women would not be credited with the creation of pole dancing if this was a direct influence. So the next one is Chinese pole. I couldn't find too much on the historical Chinese pole work, but looking at more modern versions of Chinese pole is male-centered. It's similar to the Malakam because it's men climbing and jumping between poles. The thing that Chinese pole gets a little closer to pole dancing than Indian is there's more, I want to say, posing. It's basically being like, look at how strong I am. So moves like a human flag are typical in Chinese pole. Unlike Indian style, this was for men, warriors to show off strength. Something I want to bring up with both of these styles is that now in modern pole dancing, yes, we integrate these styles, but they're not a direct influence in how pole dancing was started. So saying pole dancing started 1200 years ago and referencing these styles doesn't add up. Now we'll take in any influence that was near a pole at all, for sure, but calling these 2 direct influences, it's like saying the maypole was a direct influence when it was just a pagan ceremony. And in fact, I would argue a maypole is more likely to be an influence because there was more women involved. But I haven't been able to historically draw a line between a maypole and Moulin Rouge, so even that's a weak connection. And as I mentioned earlier, as of 2020, I've seen routines in basically any style you can think of. I've seen a man pole dancing to Singing in the Rain. As somebody who saw that movie with my mom, and I did tap as a kid, and Singing in the Rain was one of the first dance pieces I did as a child. I think I was 3, and I had a little umbrella, and my dance teacher was so proud of me for being able to release the umbrella and close it without hurting my thumb. So even though I've seen a routine that says Singing in the Rain was not an influence for the sport of pole dancing. Just because there is entertainment on a pole doesn't mean it's a direct influence. It can be a direct influence for one person. So people today can take a routine of Chinese pole and look at depictions of the Malakam and integrate that into their routines, but it's not a direct influence for pole dancing as a sport, as a fitness routine. Is that coming across? I don't want to take away anybody's work with those styles, but it's not a direct influence, especially because so many people who are teaching pole dance has taken the Malakam 1200 years ago as fact. The women who created pole dancing are alive, who took pole dancing from a strip club and created a fitness routine. They're alive. It wasn't that long ago that they have been quoted as saying, stripping helped my body. I wanted to help other people get those same results. And these women created a global movement, and I don't think that their contribution and the long history of stripping and the racial aspects of stripping should go unnoticed. If you look at pole dancing and stripping today, you should be able to notice the racial discrepancy as well. I looked at celebrities who used to be strippers. Men who used to be strippers has not affected their career at all, like Channing Tatum, and Chris Pratt was a male stripper back in the day. Hasn't slowed them down at all. Women who are white and who used to be strippers, it's almost never brought up. Courtney Love was a stripper, which is almost never talked about. And Lady Gaga was a stripper when she was younger, and that's not talked about either. And women of color who strip, their history with sex work gets talked about all the time. Like Cardi B, constantly used against her. Cardi B's become more politically minded in the past year. She's gone on I think it was Instagram Live with Bernie Sanders. Every time that she does that, people bring up the fact that she's a stripper, as if you can't be a whole person after stripping. Racial implications are heavy in the pole dancing industry as well. I know of like 2 studios in North America that are run by women of color, and there are a lot more than 2 that exist. There was a lot of racial components in the early 20th century related to cabarets and grindhouses. I think it's necessary to mention that that hasn't gone away. And I know I'm sitting here on YouTube as a white woman talking about this. I think it's important to bring up, because those struggles still exist today, the respectability of the dancers that was highly racialized in the early 20th century still exists in 2020. So I live in Canada and we don't have as big of a pool to draw from. So I'll use the US as an example. I follow a few strippers on Instagram, and the difference between white clubs and black clubs is respectability. We like to think we're an evolved people, but we still have the same race and respectability politics involved as we did in the early 20th century. And because pole dancing and stripping are so intertwined, it would be naive to say there isn't a racialized component to pole dancing as well. I'm not sure if I have phrase this issue with the level of seriousness that it needs. I know I'm white and I'm talking about the history of pole dancing and racial gaps, so instead of continuing to talk about that, I will link below a bunch of women who I greatly respect and appreciate having in the community. So that's all I had for the history of pole dancing. I hope it wasn't too controversial. If you didn't like this video and you think that I'm uninformed, 1, you're wrong. 2, you are who I'm talking to when I say get a new sport. And number 3, unsubscribe. So if you did find this video informative, please like and subscribe. I will be posting my regular content next week. We're gonna be talking about leg and hip things next week. And also I wanna say, if you didn't like this video, if you have a problem with strippers being the only direct influence for pole dancing, you can get out. I don't need you. So that's it. Please like and subscribe. I will be back next week for a regular basics video. I think I'll do cool leg and hip things to round off the lower body. If you have a problem with that, leave a comment. If you have a problem with this video, just get out. Don't leave a comment. You can just leave. So that's it, and I will see you Tuesday. Also, side note, this lighting is incredible.